often people might have a trial date scheduled and they turn up to court and then it doesn't happen. And that could happen 3 or 4 times over the course of your case. And every time is really emotionally difficult for a lot of victims and witnesses to deal with. It's really draining. And also for defendants, they've got this kind of hanging over them. These are people who haven't been convicted of an offence often, and it's just incredibly difficult for them to sort of move on with their lives.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And in this episode, we're going to take a closer look at one particular part of the public services, and that is the Crown Court, the part of the criminal justice system responsible for handling the most serious offences in England and Wales. Over recent years, the number of outstanding cases, what is often called the backlog, has soared. Despite increasing funding and more court time, it remains stubbornly high. So what's really going on? Is this part of the public sector productivity crisis that we hear about? Has productivity in the courts taken a hit? And why are cases being processed more slowly? What should we do? What can we do to turn that around? To help us unpack all of this, I'm joined by Ben Zaranko, who's Associate Director here at the IFS, and Cassia Rowland, a Senior Researcher at the Institute for Government, who leads their work on criminal justice. Ben, Cassia, welcome. So let's start at the beginning. This is, after all, an area that I'm not enormously familiar with, and I suspect some listeners to the IFS Zooms In don't know everything there is to know about the justice system and how Crown Courts work. So Cassia, why don't you just begin by just explaining what it is that we're talking about? What is the Crown Court? What does it do? How does it fit into the wider system? And just how big is it? I mean, how many cases does it deal with?
The criminal courts in England and Wales are basically split in two. So you have the Magistrate's Court, which deals with the vast majority of criminal offences. Your kind of shoplifting, non-payment of council tax, or like low-level theft. Exactly, motoring offences. Then you've got the Crown Court that sits above the Magistrate's Courts and deals with more serious offences. So robbery, murder, manslaughter, those kinds of things. It's a relatively small number that go to the Crown Court. It's about 100,000 cases a year. But the Crown Court is kind of what you picture when you think of a criminal trial. That's, you've got the barristers in wigs, you've got the jury there, and you've got the judge, although they don't have a gavel, I'm sorry to say.
But they do have a wig.
And so it's only Crown Court trials that have juries, and almost all criminal cases are dealt with in the magistrates' courts, often essentially just on paper with kind of the magistrate and possibly, the defendant not there, lawyers not there, just kind of sat in a room. It's really important to stress that it's a small part of the criminal courts as a whole in terms of the number of cases that they're dealing with, but it's a really big part of time and money that gets spent on criminal courts. In terms of how a case sort of progresses through the system, so it's investigated by the police, they might then refer it to the Crown Prosecution Service, and they decide if there's enough evidence to make a charge. That then starts in the magistrates' courts, confusingly, before being sent to the Crown Court, where either the defendant will plead guilty and they'll get sentenced, or they'll plead not guilty and then there'll be a trial and they will either be acquitted or sentenced there in the Crown Court. So it's a much bigger enterprise convicting someone through the Crown Court than it is in the Magistrates' Court, where a large majority of cases are now just dealt with on paper, often without the defendant even being in the room.
And am I right that Crown Courts take cases where there is a possibility of a prison sentence of more than a year? Is that right?
That is right. So magistrates' courts can now send someone to prison for up to a year for certain kinds of offences. Crown courts have to deal with all sentences of more than a year in prison. And obviously their maximum sentencing power goes all the way up to a whole life order, someone spending the whole rest of their life in prison.
And some accused can make a choice between a magistrate's court and a Crown Court.
They can. So you have what are called triable either way offences, and the clue's in the name. They can either be tried in the magistrate's courts or in the Crown Court. And defendants can choose to essentially exercise their right to a trial by jury. And that isn't very common, but it does sometimes happen. There's not great data on it, but the evidence does suggest it's not necessarily a brilliant idea if you're a defendant to choose to have your trial in the Crown Court, because if the courts want to deal with it in the magistrate's court, because obviously you've potentially got a much longer prison sentence, and the courts don't tend to like it if they think you're essentially wasting court time because it could have been dealt with in the magistrate's court.
Yeah, but by going to the Crown Court, you might put off the evil day, because as we're going to come to, there's quite a long waiting list.
Exactly. It's worth saying too, about a third of people who are in prison awaiting for their trial will not ultimately get a prison sentence, either because they get acquitted or they get given a non-prison sentence. So there's a really big impact from delays to Crown Court trials on people being stuck in prison unnecessarily.
And just in case you know, just another sense of scale, how many people are in prison awaiting trial, in other words, before they've actually been convicted of anything?
It's about 20% of the total prison population now. That figure has gone up massively. So we are talking, I want to say, it's 18,000 people, something like that.
That's, well, yeah, there's 80-something thousand people in prison, isn't there? So that sounds about right. That's very striking, isn't it? That a fifth of the prison population are people who have not been convicted of anything, at least for the thing that they're being held in prison for at the moment.
Some of them have been convicted, but just not sentenced yet.
Right, okay. Anyway, so that's a substantial number of people. So the reason really we're talking about this is that something seems to have gone a bit wrong with this system over the last few years, in the sense that more and more people are waiting for trial, and that number of people has gone up rather a lot. Ben, do you want to start with sort of background to that? How many people are waiting? How long are they waiting? And how much has this waiting list gone up?
I think the key number is that at the end of last year, there were about 75,000 outstanding cases sat in this backlog. And that's not, 75,000 isn't that big a number in the context of an NHS backlog of like 8 million people, but it's still a big number because it's more than twice as high as that number was at the end of 2019. And even so, it fell steadily over the mid-2010s, ticked up in 2019, and then you have this sort of explosion in the last few years. And I think what's most concerning to me is that it's not as in some other public services where there's a big pandemic effect and then we're starting to recover, but just uncomfortably slowly. This is a backlog that is still growing quarter on quarter on quarter. It's heading up in a very startling upwards direction, and it doesn't seem to be showing any signs of turning a corner yet.
Also important to flag is that the types of cases in the backlog are more complicated than the average cases that get dealt with each year. And the reason for that is because during the pandemic, it was particularly jury trials that were more likely to be delayed because they take longer. You had to get more people in a room. Just physically, a lot of courtrooms weren't big enough to have socially distanced juries. And some especially complicated trials were even more likely to be delayed than your average trial. So things like if you have multiple defendants, that was a complete nightmare because you couldn't get all of them in socially distanced courtrooms with their legal teams and so on. So there's a real disproportionality in terms of how complex and serious the cases that are in the backlog at the moment are.
And can you give us a sense of how long cases are waiting? How long are people waiting?
There are definitely some people who are waiting upwards of 2 years. And for certain very serious offences, particularly rape and serious sexual offences, you can be waiting even longer than that.
And that's awful for the victims. And it's also presumably awful for justice because people forget things, people will drop out of giving evidence. And that just sounds awful.
It is really awful. And also in that period, often people might have a trial date scheduled and they turn up to court and then it doesn't happen. And that could happen 3 or 4 times over the course of your case. And every time is really emotionally difficult for a lot of victims and witnesses to deal with. It's really draining. And also for defendants, they've got this kind of hanging over them. These are people who haven't been convicted of an offence often. And it's just incredibly difficult for them to sort of move on with their lives whilst they've got that over their heads.
We heard that this sort of backlog ballooned during COVID, but is actually continuing to rise. I mean, do we know why it's so continuing to rise and why, as we'll come on to, despite additional resources in the system, we're not dealing with it very well?
I think the big problem is that courts just are struggling to deal with cases as quickly as they used to. They just aren't processing the cases that are coming in as efficiently and as quickly. And there's a number of reasons for that, which I think one of the big ones is a lack of criminal lawyers. So we've got real problems in terms of lawyers just not being in court when their case is listed.
So when you say lack of criminal lawyers, I mean we don't have enough of them?
We literally just don't have enough of them. So
You don't often hear not enough lawyers, do you?
Well, that's part of the problem is that...
Depends who you ask, I think.
Yeah. But why would you be a criminal lawyer rather than a different kind of lawyer in the current situation?
So this is to do with their pay. That,
the pay
criminal lawyers, particularly paid by the state, have seen their pay fall relatively.
Yes. So, I mean, legal aid was cut very substantially in the early part of the 2010s. That's the kind of state funding for a lot of criminal cases that defendants rely on. And it's never recovered to its earlier levels. And there's also things like you're paid when a case gets finished, right? So if you're a young criminal barrister, you could be waiting a year, 2 years to get paid for work that you're doing now. And that's just not a sustainable way to build a career. So we see real problems with an aging workforce in the criminal bar and also criminal solicitors as well. And also there's just kind of increasingly people are leaving the profession. And we're also seeing in some cases shortages of judges. And there can be a bit of a sort of trade-off there in that some criminal barristers will sit as part-time judges. And so there's this constant, you don't have enough judges, so you get more of your barristers to sit as judges, and then you don't have enough barristers, and it is all a bit of a disaster.
Oh, well, that sums it up nicely. Any other thoughts, Ben, on why this backlog?
Well, the court is sitting more often, more days than it did in the past. So it's sitting for about 30% more days in 2024 than it did in 2019.
So that means there are just 30% more days when judges and so on, are in court trying to sort out these trials. So you'd think they'd be doing 30% more cases.
Right. And I suppose the number of sitting days is it's a proxy measure for the amount of capacity the court's got. So that's up 30%. But the number of cases that the court disposes of each year, so finishes, is up by 17%. And even that's following a substantial improvement in 2024.
Well, it's up. So
it's up.
You'd think that the backlog should be coming down.
So, okay, two things there. One, it's up, but it's not up by 30%.
Yeah, so we can see it's not
taking,
up by as much.
It's taking more court resource to deal with the average case. The number of receipts, the number of cases coming into the system has gone up, and that's gone up by more. So
is that because there's more criminality?
Well, do you remember Boris Johnson?
I remember him.
Do you remember his pledge to hire 20,000 more police officers?
Oh yes, more policemen. Therefore,
well,
more.
They're not just sat around eating
nothing.
donuts and cracking jokes at the station. They're out. They're out arresting people, and they're out. Finding them guilty of crimes.
Oh, that's the trouble, isn't it? Yes.
So there's more cases flowing into the system as well, and so that's increased by more, and so that's why the waiting list, if you want to call it that, the backlog is increasing quarter on quarter. Now, had the number of case disposals, completions, kept pace with increases in sitting days, that would have been enough to have the backlog falling. So I think that the amount of demand on the system is partly a function of how police behave, how much crime there is, lots of other things as well. But what's within the court's control to some extent is how fast it gets through cases. And I think that's a really first order issue in explaining what's happened to the backlog. Now, one thing that has been a very notable change, if you talk to people in and around the system, it's that the sort of mix of cases the court's dealing with has changed quite a lot over time. And in particular, partly due to policy changes, sexual offences are a much bigger fraction of the total than previously. They are more time intensive to deal with. There's additional hearings, there's additional steps, there's additional protections and so on. They're often more complicated. People don't tend to plead guilty in the way that they do to other offences. Similarly, more violent offences, where similarly the fraction of people pleading guilty is lower, whereas people accused of theft are much more likely to just say, okay, you've got me. It doesn't happen so much in other cases. So those things combined, I mean, that the cases that the court is having to face tend to be more complicated on average, more time intensive on average, and that's slowing the system down.
And Cassia, one of the I was a member of the Times Justice Commission that reported 2 or 3 months ago, and we took evidence from all sorts of people across the justice system. And one of the things that I got a sense of, at least from talking to some of these people, there were some systemic problems here. Often you turn up to court and there wouldn't be a translator available if the person wasn't an English speaker. Or there'd be problems transporting people on remand from prison to the court and people just wouldn't turn up. Or the Crown Prosecution Service wouldn't have the appropriate evidence and so on available. Is that more than anecdote? Is that a real sort of problem in the system?
Those are definitely all real problems in the system and that are really interfering with the court's ability to kind of function. We've seen what's called the ineffective trial rate. So that's when a trial is scheduled and then on the day it is kind of cancelled and has to be rearranged for a later date. So that has gone up substantially. It's now around a quarter of all scheduled trials are cancelled on the day and have to be rescheduled.
It's an extraordinary waste of resource. So everyone turns up, the judges turn up, the barristers turn up, the juries.
Well, sometimes the barristers don't turn up, but that's the problem.
Maybe the barristers don't turn up, but a lot of people turn up and then nothing happens.
Yes, absolutely. And also it becomes a bit self-fulfilling in that if you think a case isn't going to go ahead, maybe you don't bother going to court because, you know that 8 times out of 10 it doesn't happen, but the remaining 2 times out of 10, you're the reason it doesn't happen. So you get into these really damaging cycles.
Not as bad as 8 times out of 10, is it?
Well, it depends because some cases are listed with a fixed date and some they're what's called floaters. So the idea is that when some of the fixed ones don't actually happen, you pull up the floating cases.
Well, everyone's just supposed to be waiting around in case.
Exactly.
That's madness.
That is what used to happen.
Okay.
But very much kind of post-pandemic, that's not happening, partly because demand on the system is really high. So the lawyers have other places to be and so on. But there's also potentially a remote hearings aspect to this. We've heard quite mixed things talking to people about whether remote hearings make the courts more or less efficient.
So just to be clear, a remote hearing would be what if a witness was beamed in over Zoom?
Yes, or indeed everyone. Sometimes you get the prosecution, the defence, the defendant, all dialing in on Zoom, essentially.
You'd have thought that would be an opportunity for increased productivity.
Well, you would, but the trick is that because those have to be at specific times generally, right? So you set your Zoom call up for 11 o'clock and no one's ready until 11 o'clock. Whereas with hearings that are listed in person, you are kind of in the court and you're just waiting to be pulled in. So certainly some judges are of the view that they can't kind of rattle through them as quickly as they used to, because if you expect a hearing to take 20 minutes and it actually only takes 10, you've then got 10 minutes whilst you're waiting for the next one to start.
I see. So we know that the justice system had cuts in spending over the 2010s. To what extent do we think this is down to lack of resource, and to what extent is this down to other things?
I mean, I think that the fall off in the rate at which the court's disposing of cases, that's happening despite a recent increase in resources, right? The point is resources have increased and yet the sitting days, the amount of funding and so on has increased, but they're not increasing the amount of case disposals in lockstep. So I don't think you can necessarily blame that on funding, but I think that it speaks to this broader question of it's a complex system, right? And I think it's a fragile system, and it requires lots of things to go right. It requires lots of different people to turn up. It requires lots of different systems, organizations to interact and coordinate and send documents when they're needed, and so on and so on. And if one bit goes wrong, everything else can tumble. And I think that seems to me the unfortunate answer as to what's likely to be happening, where you've had the police suffered funding cuts, you had the CPS suffer very big funding cuts.
Well, you just said the police had too much money and they were arresting lots of people.
Well, they are, but they did suffer funding cuts in the previous period. I suppose they've increased the number of officers, but maybe the non-officer staff in the police is actually still well down on where it was. And maybe they're the ones responsible for preparing documents for court cases rather than the Bobby on the beat. And I think that it looks like just all of those areas have been cut, and a lot of them have then suffered pandemic disruptions, and all of them look like they're not performing optimally, and it's all just spilling over into like a domino effect on other bits of the system. But all that being said, I don't think you can just blame this on cuts and blame this on dysfunction elsewhere. I do think that we should also be asking, and why the system does seem to be delivering less and behaving less productively and efficiently than it was previously. And some things are within the court's control, and we should absolutely be pushing the court to be using those resources as efficiently as it can.
One of the things we talk about a lot at the Institute for Government is the kind of harmful effects on productivity that some of the cuts that we saw in the 2010s had. And those are often very kind of long-term effects. So you get kind of short-term apparent improvements in productivity because the service is still working much as it used to, but you're just spending less on it. But that over time, you end up with less experienced staff, people leaving the workforce, as we've seen with criminal lawyers, the physical infrastructure, so kind of court buildings literally falling down and flooding and things like that. And that causes all kinds of productivity problems in the longer term. One of my hobby horses is that we need essentially the equivalent of the long-term workforce plan in the NHS for the criminal justice system, in that, in the same way you can't kind of hire a surgeon tomorrow off the street. There's a long training pathway. The same is true of criminal lawyers, and particularly your kind of specialist rape and serious sexual offences or very serious violent offences. These are incredibly specialised jobs, and you've got to have a pathway where you're kind of bringing people up. And you see that sort of all the way through the system. So we know there are real shortages of duty solicitors, who are the solicitors in police stations who kind of advise people when they're first brought in. And potentially, if you can get people to accept a caution or something at that stage, you keep them out of the court system altogether. And that kind of means the system as a whole works better.
Just on that issue of barristers and solicitors and shortages, I mean, bluntly, one doesn't normally think of lawyers as underpaid. I mean, what is the sort of what pay rates are we talking about here?
It's incredibly complicated to work out because it varies a lot by the particular kinds of cases. But there are definitely junior criminal barristers who are below minimum wage.
That's not good. And they can be below minimum wage if they're self-employed, effectively.
Exactly.
But presumably there are senior criminal barristers who do quite well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're a KC at the top of the criminal bar, you're doing pretty well for yourself if you're taking kind of very serious cases. But there's a lot of people underneath that who are kind of struggling to make ends meet, potentially, but also who have much more attractive career prospects elsewhere. And that's you have to think of that as part of the picture, that if you can go and do another bit of law, and potentially also kind of, often it's a vocation, right? You think that you're doing a public service, but there are other areas of law where you might think that as well, right? If you're interested in kind of inquiries law or things like that, those are much more regular, much better paid, and you don't have some of the risks that come along with focusing on criminal law.
And the same is presumably true of duty solicitors. So this is presumably not the most straightforward and attractive thing you can do as a solicitor.
I think that's exactly right. And yeah, in particular, that's one of the age groups that we know no one's going into it. We don't have kind of young duty solicitors particularly, and that's a real problem over the longer term.
So, Ben, the upshot of all of this, I mean, you've just published a report on this, is that you basically published a report saying that what we've really been coming up to is a big productivity problem here. We talk about productivity across the public sector. We often talk about productivity in the NHS and so on. And this is obviously very small relative to the NHS, but it looks like productivity in the court service has dropped off a bit of a cliff.
I think if you look at this fall off for shorthand, it's called the case disposal rate. We think that some of it can be explained by increasing case complexity, though there are lots of different ways of measuring that, but that's only part of the explanation. We talked earlier on about the ineffective trials due to, for example, the prison doesn't deliver the defendant on time. Those are a big deal, and they've gone up a lot, but they only look like they're a very small portion of the overall of total of what's going on. They're not a big quantitative factor here. There's just this big unexplained residual in economic speak, I suppose, that we struggle to explain. It looks like it's just the system not working as well or as efficiently as it used to. And we interpret that as looking like there's been a productivity reduction in this bit of the criminal justice system, even if some of the explanation for why perhaps lies elsewhere, whether it's in the CPS or in the police or in the prisons. Now, the glass half full part of this is that things do look like they were really starting to improve in 2024. There's some way to go, but if that trajectory continues, you would expect, if things keep improving and the court finds its way back on its feet, the backlog could conceivably start falling sometime soon-ish, maybe, depending on how many cases are flowing into the system and so on. I think one challenge here is that, for reasons that Cassia was saying earlier on, it doesn't strike me that this is a problem you can fix just by chucking money at it. Now, I'm sure extra money would help, but you can't just magic into existence all those criminal barristers who need 10 years to train. You can't just magic into existence all the judges. And indeed, if you did, there might have fewer criminal barristers left over. Similarly, if the court somehow pulled a magic lever and started rattling through cases like nobody's business, you're going to find some of those people guilty and you've got to lock them up somewhere. The prisons are full, so it's one thing saying, if we can get all those people on remand in prison through the court system, great, but you're going to send some of them straight back when they're guilty. And so there's limits on how quick you can move here and how quickly you can increase inputs. But given all of that, I think that finding a way to get through cases more efficiently has to be a central focus of efforts in this area.
What happens if we do? I mean, exactly as you describe, if you start getting through more quickly, you will get more people sent to prison. And every week you read that prisons are full and they're letting people out early. How do you square that?
Well, I think that's why the policy focus is shifting to like sentencing reform. And that's all I'm going to say about sentencing reform, because I don't know anything about it. But also managing demand on the Crown Court. So there was a period when the government changed the rules and let magistrates deal with a greater number of cases, some slightly more severe cases. I think the problem was they were getting through cases too quickly and the prisons were full. But you could imagine trying to reduce the caseload that the Crown Court faces by changing demand. But I think that's why policy is thinking more creatively.
There is a review going on at the moment. So there have been quite a few reviews announced over the last year or so since we had the new government. But this is led by Sir Brian Levison and is a review into the criminal courts. And one of the options they're looking at is a really fundamental structural reform to the court system. So as we've talked about, there's the two tiers. You've got the magistrates' courts and the Crown Court. And this proposal has been made that you could introduce a third tier, a kind of intermediate court that would not have a jury trial like the Crown Court does, but instead would have a judge and two magistrates sitting in a panel, and they would kind of hear the trial, they'd pass the verdict, and then they'd sentence as well. And that would be for cases that are currently sent to the Crown Court, but maybe don't necessarily need the whole Crown Court trial process. Now,
So you'd limit according to the maximum prison sentence was 2 or 3 years or something.
exactly, 2 years is normally the suggested maximum.
What sort of offences is that?
They haven't been that specific, I have to say. I think they would all be cases that are currently triable either way. So it might be things like serious theft offences. Obviously, if you steal a chocolate bar from a corner shop, hopefully it's not getting into the courts at all. But if it does, it's in the magistrate's court. If you're kind of stealing £10 million from an elderly woman that you care for, that's probably going to the Crown Court. But there's quite a lot in the middle. And so some of those kind of medium cases, some of your more serious but not the most serious drug offences, violent offences, things like that might well sit in the middle. I think there's a lot of reasons to be sceptical about that approach. I think it would be incredibly time-consuming to set up, right? That kind of structural change takes a long time.
Why? That sounds very straightforward. I take a judge and a couple of magistrates.
Well, you have to have new primary legislation, right? Because you've got to change kind of where offences are dealt with. You've got to figure out a pay structure for all of your lawyers, and obviously they're all really unhappy about their pay at the moment. So they're probably going to say, well, why should we do this? It's completely against our interests. So unless you pay us the same as you do in the Crown Court, we're just not going to do it. And you've got to work with them to some degree. And you've got to get the kind of all of the other bits around it in place. So you need the physical rooms. Like, we know that a lack of court space and kind of poor quality of court buildings is a real
You could do that
drag
anywhere,
on
couldn't you? I mean,
productivity.
if that is just literally a panel of 3, I mean, you could hire a meeting room.
I guess you could. I suspect judges might not be super keen on that idea.
Well, it's about time they were. So your objections are sort of practical rather than philosophical.
I think there are some practical objections, but I also I'm not quite sure what the goal is, right? So you could instead just reduce the kind or change which kinds of cases can be sent to the Crown Court.
So more stuff goes to magistrates.
Yes. So instead of having them be triable only, have them only eligible for trial in the Magistrate's Court. And that would achieve pretty much the same goal, but without having to set up this whole additional kind of infrastructure. And I think also in the context of the prison capacity crisis, there's good arguments for reducing the number of people that you're sending to prison for that kind of 1 to 2 year period, given just how serious the situation in prisons is. So I think that would, you potentially risk ending up sending people who currently are sent to prison for kind of 9 months or a year, and instead you send them for maybe 15 months or something like that. And that's the last thing that the system needs at the moment.
So some more, are the magistrates' courts working well?
That depends on what your kind of outcome metrics are, I guess. So they are also seeing kind of more cases coming in because of the increase in police charges and things like that. They have managed to keep on top of that better than the Crown Court, but there's a lot of variation across the country. And there are some places where you could be waiting a year for a magistrate's court trial, which is ludicrous, right? This is something that ideally you'd be told to turn up to court in maybe a month at most. And your chances of getting a good outcome are obviously much better if you can do this kind of thing quickly, right? That you can either have sort of whatever appropriate intervention that the court decides, that might be things like a drug treatment order or things like that. And if you do that now, rather than in 11 months' time, that's much better for everyone. But also just things like having your defendant turn up, right? If someone's living quite a chaotic life, offending quite frequently, potentially, maybe they're homeless or things like that, you've got a much better chance of getting them in court in a month than you do in a year. And so there are these ways that the kind of delays can make things even worse in terms of productivity.
So that's really interesting, because I think that relates to one question I've always had about what's happening in the Crown Court is just how much of this is like sort of self-propelling in the sense that you have a longer Crown Court backlog. Presumably someone has to spend more time managing those cases and keeping people up to date or whatever. And then when they come around, maybe people have forgotten some stuff. Your witnesses are less, the recollection isn't as good. Some documents gone missing. And I guess as well as that, it changes people's behavior, right? If I'm thinking about, do I plead guilty? Do I take my chances? I might think very differently of that if the trial's next week versus in 2 years. Some people have very short time horizons and might be at least delay any decision about a guilty plea for longer, and it adds more work for the court. So just does having a long backlog beget a long backlog?
Well, I think that sounds to me like a part of the problem. We're in a vicious cycle here, aren't we?
Right.
Exactly. And there are also things like we talked about all of those people on remand in prison waiting for their trial. Now, there are limits on how long you can be in prison before you have to have a trial, which is probably a good thing. I think we can all agree. But the court basically has to approve any time someone's in prison longer than that time limit on a case-by-case basis. And so the Crown Prosecution Service is having to manage all of these cases, and the court has to say, yes, I accept that we should have had that, serious assault trial by now, but we haven't, and we're not just going to let him out because we haven't had the trial. So, and then you've got to keep doing that every 4 months until the trial actually happens.
But I suppose the flip side is we're in a vicious cycle now, but we could end up, bit of a one last push, and next thing we're in a propitious cycle, and everything's getting easier, everything's getting better. Things were improved, not in every metric, but the backlog was falling up until about 2019. We've done this before. We could conceivably do it again.
So in terms of what the government's doing, we've got the reviews. We've had the Gawk review of sentencing. We've got the Leveson review of the court structures. There are more sitting days, which reflects more input. So is the government doing anything else to flip us out of this cycle?
I think those are the main ones. And I think the reason why the Leveson review is coming after the Gawk review is exactly what we were talking about before in terms of prison capacity, right? They were concerned that if they dealt too quickly with the problems in the Crown Court, it would only make things worse in prisons. I think it's concerning that they waited as long as they did to kind of make some of these changes, particularly if they're looking at very fundamental changes to how the courts operate. That is going to take time to put in place. But there are limits to what the government can do. So things like listing, which kind of cases are due to be heard in the courts, that sits with the judges, and the government doesn't have any ability or power to intervene in that. So they can't say, oh, well, actually, we're going to fast track these kinds of cases, because that's kind of interfering with the independence of the courts.
In terms of things they could do, my sense from what you've said over the last half hour or so is you would focus on the workforce issues to really unblock this. Is that fair?
I think workforce and capital investment in kind of the court buildings and some of the technology. So we talked a little bit about that remote hearings point, and the number of conversations I've had with people who are just demented that they cannot get their video link to work, and how much time is spent kind of doing that. And that's when you have got everyone there in the courtroom.
In my seeming role as the dedicated podcast optimist, though, I do think that who'd have thought it? There has been an increase in capital funding for the MOJ, big increases in the last few years, like more than the average department, way above where it was previously. So, and in particular, I think that for HMCTS. And so you'd hope
HMCTS being
His Majesty's, I should say, Courts and Tribunal Service, where there should be eventually that spending should yield physical results and new buildings and new equipment and so on that can be put to good use. The government has plans to spend quite a lot more on capital over the next few years. Now, we don't know how that's going to be allocated yet, but it seems conceivable that the MOJ might benefit. It's much cheaper to build a new courtroom than it is a new nuclear power station,
or a new prison.
Or a new prison. The sums involved here aren't that
But
big.
for each new courtroom, you need more prison places.
Well, oh no, back in the
This
cycles
is,
again.
This is a horrible system, isn't it? I mean, clearly the answer is to have fewer police but then more criminals on the streets. Oh, God, it's a nightmare.
Well, but that might be the new government's plan. So that's if you read the papers, it seems to be. But I suppose that you might expect some of that capital spending eventually to yield benefits, and then also if you try to be optimistic, this is a prime minister who might take a particular interest in the justice system and might be willing to prioritize it and push it on. So if you're in the justice system, maybe that's another reason to feel slightly more optimistic than you otherwise would.
I think there are also some things we can do to reduce demand on the court that aren't kind of abandon arresting anyone.
Good.
So, as I've talked about how cases get sent from the magistrates to the Crown Court, and you can just keep more of them in the magistrates' court, we have seen a very kind of steady increase in the proportion of defendants who can be sent to the Crown Court who are sent to the Crown Court. Now, in a small number of cases, that may be because the defendant chooses to go to the Crown Court, but mostly it will be the magistrates sending the case to the Crown Court. And that's normally because they think they don't have the power to give a high enough sentence. So, as we've said, magistrates can only sentence someone to a year in prison, and that's a relatively recent change. It used to be 6 months for a single offence. And that if you can kind of keep more cases in the magistrates' courts, you're potentially reducing some of that pressure on prisons, and particularly if you're one of the proposals in the sentencing review that the government has said they're going to accept is if effectively abolishing short prison sentences under 12 months. So in exceptional circumstances, they'll still be able to do
more
that.
tagging, more probation.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So that should help a fair bit with prison space.
Yeah. So if those cases, they're not going to get that kind of longer or medium length sentence in the Crown Court. So magistrates' courts can potentially be persuaded to keep those cases in their court rather than sending them up to the Crown Court for trial or for sentencing. That reduces demand on prisons and it reduces demand on the Crown Court.
Look, we've actually ended there with two reasonably positive thoughts, I think, one from Ben and one from Cassia about ways that this might get better over time. But we probably ought to draw, maybe it's a good moment to draw this conversation to an end. I think what I take from this is not surprising. This is an incredibly complex system where all of the bits and pieces from the police, the courts, the magistrate system, the prisons, the probation service, they all obviously fit together, and you change something in one part of it and it has knock-on effects elsewhere. There's clearly been a real problem over the last 5 years in the justice system, in the Crown Courts, with increased backlog, which has not really begun to go down since COVID, and therefore a measured fall in productivity, and all sorts of reasons for that. More complex cases, a problem with the workforce, problem with the equipment that they're working with, a problem with systems, not getting the right people to the right places at the right time. So a very complicated thing to sort out, but we hope we can move out of this vicious circle into a more virtuous circle over time. I found this absolutely fascinating. So Ben, thank you. Cassia, particularly, thank you very much for coming in from the Institute for Government. And thank you everyone to listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. If you enjoyed this episode, do subscribe in your podcast app and share it with anyone who might be interested. And if you'd like to support our work, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. Just check the link in the episode description. Thank you again for listening, and we will see you next time.